Contemporary culture, at least in the West, is often characterized by a rejection of coherent, unitary, stable identities, by the impulse to transgress, to break down anything from borders to genders. A really instructive moment for understanding this conception came about in 2020 with an email leak concerning Whole Foods, the supermarket company owned by Amazon, which revealed that the company had been producing what's called a heat map of its various locations. What this kind of map does is display different characteristics of different locations, including to do with the workforce employed at each one. For example, it would track the background, the ethnic and linguistic composition of the employee body at a given Whole Foods supermarket, as well as whether a location had a union, whether the workers at some store had unionized in order to negotiate for better conditions and become a headache for management. By doing this, company bosses were able to determine that the more diverse a workforce is, the more it's made up of folks from different backgrounds, ethnic and linguistic, the less likely workers are to come together and form a union. The more diversity, the less people understand each other's cultural cues and context and references, the less they feel connected and work together as a unit in favor of their own interests, as distinct from the interests of the managers and company bosses. That explains why woke capitalism, so called, is a thing at all. Why corporations push for mass migration, for example. It's about reducing the population whose workers expect a higher salary in the first world and import folks from economically depressed areas willing to work for less. But it's also about reducing social cohesion so that society is easier to control. I think that really extrapolated to politics reveals why diversity is such a weapon. In their 2020 study on ethnic diversity and social trust, researchers of the University of Copenhagen and Aarhus University compiled findings from a range of relevant studies. They did what's called a meta-analytical review of different studies, drawing them all together. And their conclusions were as follows. One, social trust is indeed lowest in more ethnically diverse contexts, albeit by a small margin. It was especially true of trust between neighbors and general social trust, but it applied across the board. In other words, neighborhood cohesion and a broad sense of trust in society at large are among the factors most negatively impacted by diversity. The negative relationship between diversity and social trust is strongest in those who actually experience it, those who live close to their neighbor from a different background. Put differently, living in a diverse setting accentuates rather than attenuates, increases rather than decreases the breakdown of social trust. Interestingly, the negative relationship between diversity and social trust remains statistically significant even when one is controlling for other variables like socioeconomic status or criminality. So, yeah, we often hear that class and economic status matter more than culture, background, etc. And that might be true in many ways. But even when folks are from the same socioeconomic class and equally likely to engage in criminal activity or to be incentivized to do so, diversity still reduces social trust. This means that identity and culture are not simply neutral factors, obfuscating class issues or economic issues. They have their own impact. Identity and culture matter on their own terms. Human beings are naturally endowed of an identity. We naturally form units, and those units function together. This is not to condemn pluralism as such. It can work outside the context of mass migration, and the emergence of new identities is not incompatible with the preservation of those older identities, ethno-cultural, religious identities, which is what gets attacked today as somehow bigoted.